The kitchen smelled like burnt ambition and cheap coffee, which was basically the scent of every Tuesday morning at Calloway Fine Dining before the lunch rush. Corrine Voss noticed it the second she pushed through the staff entrance. That particular combination of yesterday's stock reduction and the industrial cleaner they used on the tile grout. After 4 years, she could read the whole morning in one breath. Burned coffee meant Chef Renard had arrived early and was already in a mood. The grout smell meant Marcus from overnight had been pulling extra hours again and had cleaned to keep himself awake. And the silence from the prep kitchen meant that whoever was supposed to be dicing the shallots at 6:30 had not shown up. She set her knife roll on the shelf above her locker, changed into her whites, and went to find the shallots herself. This was not in her job description. Her job description, technically, was sommelier. The wine program at Calloway was her responsibility. The cellar, the pairings, the relationships with the distributors, the training of the floor staff on how to describe a Burgundy without sounding like they were reading from a dictionary. She had built all of it over 4 years, starting from a list of 60 bottles and 1 broken wine fridge, and had grown it to a cellar of 400 labels and a reputation that had been mentioned, briefly but genuinely, in a Toronto Life piece last spring. But the shallots needed to be diced, so she diced them. She was halfway through the second bag when Chef Renard came in, assessed the situation with the economy of someone who had long since stopped being surprised by anything, and poured her a coffee without being asked. "Belmont called in," he said. "It wasn't a question. I assumed." Corrine Voss set down her knife and accepted the coffee with both hands. It was terrible. She drank it gratefully. "The Whitmore reservation is tonight." He said it the way a person says the name of a storm system, with respect and a certain amount of dread. She already knew. She had known for 3 weeks. The Whitmore dinner was not a reservation in the ordinary sense. It was the kind of evening that Calloway had spent 6 months trying to arrange. A private tasting for Ellsworth Whitmore and 14 members of his family, celebrating 50 years since the man had opened his first restaurant in Halifax with borrowed money and a handshake. He was 73 now and had turned that one restaurant into 32, across 5 provinces. His son, Patrick Whitmore, had taken over operations 8 years ago. His daughter ran the foundation. His grandchildren were starting to appear in the kind of magazine profiles that mattered. They were not difficult people, from what Corrine had heard. They were simply important ones, which was a different kind of difficult. The wine program for the evening was hers. Every bottle, every pairing. Every decision about when to pour and when to let a glass breathe and how to explain a 2009 Barolo to a man who had been in the industry longer than she had been alive, without condescending to him or boring him. She had been preparing the selection for 3 weeks. She had tasted through the cellar twice. She had written notes she would never read aloud but had committed to memory. She was ready. What she didn't know, when she went back to the shallots and the coffee and the particular Tuesday morning quiet of the prep kitchen, was that 2 floors above her, in the private dining manager's office, a conversation had just ended that concerned her directly. The person who started it was a man named Foster Crane. Foster Crane had been at Calloway for 11 months. He had come from a restaurant group in Vancouver with a title that sounded important, Director of Guest Experience, and an ease with people that read at first glance as warmth. He remembered names. He laughed at the right moments. He had a way of filling a room that made people feel, briefly, that he was very interested in whatever they were saying. Corrine had figured him out by month 3. She was civil to him. She was professional. She did not trust him. He was the kind of person who positioned himself near success without contributing to it, and she had watched him do it twice already. Once with the private dining team's award nomination, where he had attached his name to a project he had never worked on, and once with the journalist who had come to profile the restaurant and had left with Foster Crane's card and a quote attributed to senior management. Neither thing had been a disaster. Both things had been noted. That Tuesday morning, Foster Crane had been in the private dining manager's office with a man named Bryce Weller, who was one of the floor managers and who had the specific quality of someone who laughed at everything. His superior said slightly too quickly. The conversation had lasted about 9 minutes. Corrine did not hear it. She was downstairs with the shallots. But the server named June, who had been in the hallway replacing the batteries in the reservation terminal and who had not been noticed, heard most of it. And what she heard made her stand very still for a moment with the terminal in her hands before she finished the job and went downstairs to the break room, where she sat alone for 4 minutes, and then she went to find Corrine. She found her in the cellar, which was where Corrine spent most of the hour before service. It was a long, narrow room with soft lighting and temperature control, and a quiet that felt deliberate like the inside of a library. Corrine had a checklist in her hand and was moving slowly along the racks, pulling bottles at intervals and holding them up to the light with the focus of someone who was not available for small talk. June stood at the door for a moment. "Can I talk to you for a minute?" Corrine looked up. June was 24, third-year server, reliable, not dramatic. If she was standing in the cellar doorway with that expression, it was not about the shallots. "Come in," Corrine said. June came in. She closed the door behind her, which told Corrine more than anything she had said so far. "I was in the upstairs hallway this morning, doing the terminal." June paused. "I wasn't trying to listen." "Okay." Foster and Bryce were in the office. The door was almost closed, not fully. Another pause. "They were talking about tonight." Corrine waited. Foster said. June stopped, started again. "He said he had $50 that said you'd fall apart in front of the Whitmores. That you'd either go too technical and bore them or go too casual and embarrass the restaurant." She looked at her hands. Bryce said he'd take that bet. They were laughing. The cellar was very quiet. Corrine set the bottle she was holding back in the rack with the same care she always used. She looked at it for a moment. Then she looked at June. "Thank you for telling me," she said. June searched her face. "I'm fine." Corrine said it without sharpness and without performance. She was fine. Not in the way people say it to end a conversation, but in the actual sense, which was more unsettling. "Go get breakfast before service. It's going to be a long night." June went. Corrine stayed in the cellar for another 6 minutes, alone with the bottles and the soft hum of the temperature control, and she thought about almost nothing at all. Then she finished her checklist and went to make sure the glassware was polished correctly. The Whitmore party arrived at 7:15. There were 16 of them in the end. Ellsworth Whitmore had mentioned, when confirming, that 2 cousins had driven down from Barrie, and was that all right, and of course it was all right, which meant Corrine had spent the previous afternoon selecting 2 additional bottles and reorganizing the pour sequence. Ellsworth Whitmore was the kind of man who shook hands like he meant it. He was tall and slightly stooped with age, with white hair and a face that had laugh lines so established they were architectural. He wore a jacket that was good quality and slightly too warm for the restaurant, and he hadn't noticed because he wasn't thinking about himself. He was looking at his family, counting them quietly, making sure everyone had found their seat. His son Patrick was beside him. Younger, sharper, the kind of precise that comes from spending a decade running something his father had built and feeling the weight of that every day. He assessed the room in the way a person assesses a room when they are responsible for something. Corrine recognized it because it was the same thing she did. She approached the table at 7:20, after the water had been poured and the menus had been distributed and the table had had 2 minutes to settle. "Good evening. I'm Corrine Voss, Calloway's sommelier. I'll be guiding the wine program for you tonight." She said it to Ellsworth first because this was his evening, and then to the table at large. "I understand we have some wine lovers in the group, and I'm told at least one person who'd rather just have something that tastes good without a lecture about it." There was a beat, and then 3 people laughed, including Ellsworth himself, and the tension that exists in every formal dining room for the first 4 minutes dissolved in the way it only does when someone is being genuine. "That would be my wife," Ellsworth said. 49 years, and she still hasn't forgiven me for ordering a bottle of Burgundy on our first anniversary that took 20 minutes to describe. "Then tonight she gets the short version," Corrine said, "and the better pour." She heard a sound from the direction of the service corridor. She didn't look. She knew who it was. Foster Crane had positioned himself near the host stand for the first hour, which was within sightline of the Whitmore table. He was not subtle about it. He had a glass of water he kept not drinking, and he watched with the focused neutrality of someone who was waiting for a traffic accident that hadn't happened yet. Bryce, who was ostensibly running the floor that evening, drifted past the Whitmore table twice in the first 30 minutes. The second time, Corrine was explaining the first pour, a Niagara Peninsula Chardonnay 2021, from a small producer that no one at the table had heard of, which was exactly the point. "The winery is about 2 hours from here," she said. "Family operation. They've been farming the same 12 acres for 3 generations, and they finally stopped apologizing for making wine that tastes like Ontario instead of Burgundy." "What does Ontario taste like?" one of the grandchildren asked. She was maybe 22, bright-eyed, the kind of curious that hadn't yet been flattened by the world. "Tonight like apple blossom in the last week of August," Corrine said. "Taste it and tell me if I'm wrong." The girl tasted it. She thought about it seriously. "You're not wrong," she said. That's actually exactly right. Ellsworth leaned over. She's right, you're not wrong. He looked at Corrine with the assessing look of someone who has known a great many people in his life who were performing competence rather than possessing it, and who had learned the difference. How long have you been doing this? Formally since my early 20s, Corrine said. Informally since my father let me taste his glass at dinner when I was 7 and I told him it smelled like the floor of a forest. Ellsworth smiled. What did he say? He said I was right. And then he said that if I could smell the forest in a glass of wine, I should probably learn what to do with that. He sounds like a good man. He was, Corrine said. She said it simply, without apology or performance, and moved on to the second bottle. By 9 o'clock, the Whitmore table had moved through 5 pours, and the kind of conversation that happens when people have eaten well and are among people they love, and don't need to perform for each other. Corrine had stepped back from the table for the main course, because the best service at that stage is invisible service. She had moved to the edge of the room where she could watch and be available without hovering. She was aware, without looking directly, that Foster Crane was still near the host stand. He had switched from water to club soda sometime around 8:30. He had not been called over to the table. He had not been needed. She was also aware, from the opposite side of the room, of Patrick Whitmore, who had slipped away from the table during the brief interval between the third and fourth course. He was standing near the wine display along the west wall, looking at the labels with the particular attention of someone who was genuinely interested, not just filling time. She crossed to him. Questions? She said. He looked up. Close up, he was maybe 40, with the kind of focus that came from being very good at something for a long time. I noticed you pulled the 2017 Pinot from the Okanagan for the duck rather than the 2019. Why? Corrine looked at him. Because the 2019 is better on paper and worse with this particular preparation. Chef Renard braises the duck with a slight bitterness at the end. Bay leaf, I think, and something else he won't tell anyone. And the 2017 has enough age to round off against that. The 2019 would fight it. He considered this. The 2019 also costs the restaurant 40% more. It does, so you chose the less expensive bottle. I chose the correct bottle, Corrine said. The cost is a coincidence. Patrick Whitmore looked at her for a moment with an expression she had seen before. The expression of a person who had been testing something without announcing it and had received a more interesting result than expected. My father's been in this industry for 50 years, he said. He says the thing that separates the people who last from the people who don't is whether they know the difference between impressive and right. Your father sounds like a good judge. He's the best one I've ever met. He looked back at the Okanagan shelf. That Chardonnay you opened first. The Ontario one, yes, can I get the producer information? I'd like to put it in 2 of our restaurants. Corrine reached into the small notebook she kept in her jacket pocket. Not her phone, the notebook, because she had learned that some conversations needed to be written down, and wrote the name and the contact and tore the page out and handed it to him. Patrick Whitmore took it and looked at it and folded it once and put it in his breast pocket. Thank you, he said, and then, after a beat, you're very good at this. I know, Corrine said. She said it without arrogance. She said it the way a person says a true thing. The evening ended at 10:47. Ellsworth Whitmore shook hands on the way out with the same seriousness with which he had shaken them on the way in. He shook the host's hand and the floor manager's hand, and he stopped when he got to Corrine and shook her hand and held it for a moment longer. The wine with the lake trout, he said. What was it? A white from Prince Edward County. A winemaker named Albright. Small production. She makes about 400 cases a year. Find out if she has a distribution contact, he said. Patrick will call. I'll have it to you by Thursday, Corrine said. He nodded and let go of her hand and went to find his wife, who was standing near the door in a coat the color of autumn leaves, and who looked at her husband with the specific expression of a person who has spent 50 years with someone and still finds them worth looking at. Corrine watched them go. Behind her she heard Foster Crane's voice, low, saying something to Bryce that she didn't catch, and then a door closing. She didn't turn around. She went back to the cellar to log the evening's pours and start the end-of-service checklist, and she stayed there for a while in the quiet and the dim light, among the bottles she knew like the books on a shelf she had read more than once. She was not thinking about Foster Crane, or about the $50, or about the conversation she had never been meant to hear. She was thinking about the Ontario Chardonnay and the way the girl at the table had tasted it seriously, without self-consciousness, and said, "That's exactly right." The email from Patrick Whitmore arrived the following Thursday morning. Corrine read it at her desk in the cellar, where she did most of her administrative work, with a cup of coffee that she had made herself and that was considerably better than the Tuesday kind. The email was brief and direct. It opened with thanks for the evening, and then it moved to business. The Whitmore restaurant group was in the early stages of restructuring their wine programs across 6 locations in Ontario and British Columbia. They were looking for someone to lead the project, to audit the existing cellars, build new pairing programs, train the in-house teams, and develop relationships with Canadian producers that their current buyers had overlooked. The project would take 18 months. The position was contract, with an option to convert. He wrote, already spoken with Calloway's general manager to ensure the approach was appropriate. He noted that he was writing to her directly because he believed, in his experience, that the right person to lead a project was the person who understood not just what they were doing but why. He included one other line, almost at the end. My father said, "Make sure she knows that the duck course was the one that decided it." Corrine read the email twice, then she set down her coffee and looked at the rack of Pinot Noir in front of her. The one with the 2017 at the end, 3 bottles left, and she sat quietly for a moment with the weight of it. 18 months. 6 restaurants. Something built from a list and a handshake and a borrowed beginning, which was, when she thought about it, exactly how all the things worth having had ever started. She wrote back the same morning. The email was also brief and also direct, and it closed with the producer information for winemaker Albright in Prince Edward County, as promised. She did not mention Foster Crane. There was no reason to. Some things resolve themselves, and the ones that don't tend to be the ones you spent too much energy on. Outside the cellar, the restaurant was beginning its morning. She could hear the prep cooks arriving, and the particular clatter of the kitchen at 6:45, and somewhere above her, a door opening and footsteps crossing the floor of a room where, on a Tuesday morning not long ago, a man with $50 and a low opinion of her had been so certain about how the evening would go. She had not given him the satisfaction of knowing she had heard. She had not given him the satisfaction of being different than she would have been otherwise. Not sharper, not more guarded, not angrier. She had simply done the things she knew how to do, in the way she had always done it, in the way her father had taught her to trust when he first put a glass in her 7-year-old hand and listened, seriously, to what she had to say about what was in it. She picked up her checklist. The morning was waiting, and there was work to do, and Corrine Voss had never needed the last word. She had only ever needed the right one.